Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wrist Watch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time on the bench, we have my watch. That's right. This watch is one of mine. This is a Rolex Submariner. This one's called a meters first Submariner because if you look at the dial here, you see that the meters is listed before the feet. Normally that's flipped over. And that's exactly the kind of nerdy detail that Rolex fans love. Little stuff like that can make huge differences in price. Not on this watch, they're about the same, but little details are what it's all about. The Submariner, of course, is Rolex's dive watch. This is the watch that they developed in the 50s. This particular model was made in 1967, the one, my watch. But they came out in the 50s, and, these are meant to be waterproof and they're meant for doing diving. Most of them, I would say these days, do what we call desk diving, which is that you wear them to work or, when you're traveling or whatever. Not too many of them actually see that much deep sea action, mainly because, waterproof computers that you can wear on your wrist or carry with you can give you so much more information. But some people actually do wear watches like this as a backup to those computers in case something goes wrong with them. As you can see, this one's well worn. This one was actually the first Rolex I ever bought. When I bought this watch, I was primarily into a brand called Heuer. They later merged and became Tag Heuer. By the way, you can see the 5513 between the lugs. Rolexes on one side of the lugs will have the reference number. That's the model number of the watch. And the other side will have the serial number printed between it. Let's throw this thing on the time grapher to see how it's running now. I wear this watch all the time. You've probably seen me wear it in the videos even, so I don't expect it to be too bad. It's actually a little worse than I thought, although not terrible. A little low on amplitude for a watch of this age. I'd like to see that up in the 200s range. And then it's gaining about 13 seconds a day. So probably could use the service. And, like I said, when I first started collecting watches, I was really into Heuer from the 60s. And these are like, if you've never seen one before, they're kind of, they're like chronographs. So they're like stopwatches for racing, but, they're wristwatches. And I love those ones. But this watch really caught my eye as having just a beautiful dial, like kind of an almost perfect dial in hands. And I ended up springing for it long time ago now. I've had this watch for like 10 years or something. And they're actually worth a lot of money now. It was a lot then, but now they're like a lot. These things are like well over $10,000 for one of these. Like, 10, 12, 14 is not unheard of for these watches. So, yeah, I tell people on the channel, that you should get your watch serviced every 7 years or so, maybe 10 if you want to stretch it a little bit. Sometimes the brands will say to service them, every 5 years. And that's fine too. I find that to be maybe a little bit advantageous for the brands, let's just say. But at any rate, let's call it 7 years. And I realized I've owned this watch myself for longer than that. And I better take my own advice and service the dang thing. And who better to do it but me? So we're going to dig into my own watch today on the channel, and we're going to give it just a good old service. And, a service for a wristwatch like this, if you've never seen it happen before, is it's completely disassembled. All the parts are taken out of the case, and then every part of the movement is completely disassembled and cleaned. Then it's reassembled, and then new lubricant is applied to make sure that it's running for the longest and best that it can be for the longest. And then off you go. It's back on the wrist. And hopefully that's it. I mean, I don't know of any issues with my watch. Again, it runs pretty well, and I wear it all the time. So this is just a routine maintenance on this thing, but that is, of course, an important thing to do. And I'm not going to lie. Well, check this out. Look at the dial on this thing. I mean, is that not just like vintage perfect? It's unbelievable how beautiful that lume is. One of the things, if you're not into collecting vintage watches or it's not really your thing, is look at the color of those glow-in-the-dark hour markers around it. They get that kind of creamy color. When this came out of the factory, those were white, like stark white, like you'd see on a brand new watch today. But what happens over time is the glow-in-the-dark material, it's called luminous material, or we just call it lume for short, is in this case, it's made of tritium, which was a like very minorly radioactive substance that glowed if light hit it. And tritium, it's safe, by the way. Radium, not so safe. This is safe. Tritium ages like this. It turns into this warmer color over time, and it is beautiful. And it's also a bit hard to reproduce. So it's hard to find new watches that look like this. And it gives them kind of their own character. That dial, by the way, man, bury me with that thing. It is perfect. I just love, that's why I bought the watch, because I wasn't planning on, like I had been saving up to get another Heuer that I wanted. And then I ended up getting this Rolex instead because I found it on a website, and I was emailing with the owner, and I was just like, this thing is just gorgeous. And I asked him if he'd give me a little price break. And I told him it was my first Rolex purchase, and he said sure, and he gave me, a nice little discount, and I bought it. And I remember when I got it too, I had never actually held one of these. It's funny because my friends didn't, and for the most part don't really care about watches. Still, I have friends that do now, but my friend group didn't care. So I didn't have anybody that was like, oh, you can try out my old Rolex Submariner and see how it fits on your wrist, or see if you like the size, or, the style of it, or whatever. I just kind of got it when it arrived. I was like, wow. And the dial was the thing that really stood out. So I'm going to take the power out of the watch now. This is a good step to take as far as best practices go as you move through a service like this. Mainly just because if you do have power going through the gears of the watch, that can create tension. And if you do something wrong, or even sometimes right, and you very suddenly release that tension, things can go flying across the room and things can break. And of course, you want to try to minimize that type of risk as much as possible whenever you're working on anything like this. As you can see, this has a very typical movement for the era. It is in my mind, really, really beautiful. And I don't say that because of the finishing being so exceptional. There are brands that you may have heard of, out of Switzerland, whose real claim to fame is movement finishing, meaning how they style the movement itself. If you look, there's some of those circles you can see around the outside edge. That's called perlage. That's one thing that they can do. There's also things called Geneva stripes you may have seen, where on the top of the bridges, they have these kind of almost 3D looking stripes that go through. And then, of course, one of the big things that brands will do is on the edges of the bridges, they will bevel them. And that type of finishing is very, very tricky to get right. To get them to like a mirror polish, but even all the way around the edge. And that's where you're well and truly down the rabbit hole on watches, when you're getting into, what's the bevel finishing looking like on these bridges or whatever. But trust me, it's a big thing. And it's a lot of what some of the older, bigger brands think. Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, Vacheron Constantin, these type of brands have built much of their reputations on the movement finishing, and it's in many ways a differentiator from something like a Rolex. Now, Rolex does not ignore it, though. As you can see, this movement has a visually appealing, it's beautiful, right? I think it looks really, really nice. But the thing that's different is that Rolex isn't over-indexing on that finishing. What they're doing is they're saying, this is going to be a bulletproof machine of whoever wears this. These watches are tool watches. They were meant to be used in harsh conditions, in this case, under the ocean. And again, this thing came out in the 60s, so you got to think, okay, well, what were they doing in the 60s to try to do that? And it's about how waterproof is it, and how much damage can it take before it breaks? And, how resilient is the crystal in the case? And, the movement, how long can it run without a service? Let's say you got stuck somewhere, would it be able to keep going? And Rolex just gets check marks across the board for all of those things. These watches were built to last, and they were built to run for a long time. And one of the things that I really appreciate as we finish taking apart this first part of the movement is they were also built to be serviced. These movements are awesome to work on as a watchmaker. I do watch repair, watch restoration as a hobby. And even for me, when I first started working on Rolexes, and by the way, you can see the first Rolex I ever worked on. I did it on a video here. I've gotten a lot more comfortable working on them since. But even then, from the beginning, it was like, oh, these are so nice to work on. Like, things just kind of go where you think they're going to go, and it doesn't fight you. And, there's not this like, why did they build it like this? There's nothing like that in these. They're very, very easy to work on as far as, how to approach it mentally. You can flip the watch over now. Again, we've got this thing almost all the way taken apart. These are, this part, watch repair is a tricky hobby, but like, this isn't that hard. Like, taking stuff apart, as long as you kind of know a few things, it's not too bad. You can definitely get through it. Now, I will say, when it comes time to put stuff back together, you need to know where stuff goes, in a much more meaningful way. And, that's actually how I started this channel. It's kind of funny is that, I had been watching videos on a channel here on YouTube from Mark Lovick. He does the watch repair channel, and he also does classes now. He has a website called watchfix.com, and he does classes. I took them. He's got 5 courses over there. They're really excellent if you're looking to get into the hobby, by the way. But anyway, I was watching him, and he recommended grabbing a camera. He recommended the phone, but whatever camera you had, to film yourself disassembling the watch, so that if you get stuck, you can go back and look and figure out how things go back together. And it turns out that for my other job, I do content creation in a gaming space. I have a nice camera. And so I just set it up on a tripod and pointed it down at what I was doing. And after I looked at the video, I was like, this video looks kind of good. And then all of a sudden my brain started working on, I bet you I could, talk over this, or I could tell the story of these watches that I get, and how I, am approaching it as a hobbyist and all that kind of stuff. And that was actually the beginning of the channel itself. Okay, we can take out the mainspring here once again as we wind down the disassembly portion. I should also mention, if you're interested in starting this as a hobby as well, or if you know somebody who might be interested, I did start a website. It's called sutcliffehansen.com. And what it is I wanted to make toolkits for people who were starting out in the hobby. And the reason for that is it was very difficult when I first started to figure out what tools to get. There's a whole bunch of really cheap ones. There's a whole bunch of really expensive ones. And you don't want to get the wrong ones for the wrong size, or get some junky ones that make it so that you damage your watch, or it's not a very pleasurable experience. But also, you're trying out a hobby. You don't want to break the bank and get the very best stuff and then discover that it's not really for you and get stuck with a bunch of tools that you don't need. So what I did is I curated toolkits. So I tried out everything in them. Most of the stuff I actually use that you see right here. But I went through everything, and we have ones, for starting out, a starter box that even comes with a movement that you can work on it to practice if you're just starting out. And we have a fundamentals kit, which is kind of the next level up. And we even have a complete kit that has most of the stuff that you need to, actually pretty much everything you need to service a watch, outside of like a watch cleaning machine or something like that. Anyway, I'd love it if you check it out. It is sutcliffehansen.com if you're interested, or if you know somebody that might be interested in trying this out. It is something you can actually do. That was the thing that I learned from Mark's channel, from the watch repair channel, was that, I kind of viewed this as the domain of something that was over my head, right? Like, I just thought I could never do that. Like, you have to go to school for that. Like, it just looks way too complicated and scary. And it turns out that, like anything else, it's a step-by-step process, right? It's the type of thing where once you understand some of the fundamentals about what the parts are doing and why they're there, then you can start to understand about why you take one thing off and then the other, and you start to learn best practices, and off you go. And that's what happened with me. And, it's like anything else worthwhile. At first it's tricky, but then you start to get used to it. And, when you look back over time, you realize how much you've learned and how much you've gotten better. And that's always what attracts me to any of my hobbies. that I like to do are things that you can go really deep on like this. Okay, so everything's in the watch cleaning machine basket, but I do want to just do a test. This is more a curiosity thing, right? This is a Rolex Submariner. This watch, when it was made, was designed to go deep underwater. So I'm going to actually do a pressure test on this and just see if it holds up. This is with the gaskets that I had in it as I wore it. This is with no changing of anything. I'm just going to put the case back together and I'm going to do a pressure test on it to see, because this is supposed to be a dive watch. And I'm just curious, you know, there's kind of a prevailing wisdom about vintage watches that like you just shouldn't let them near water or anything like that. And while I definitely understand the sentiment, there are a lot of vintage watches that would be, damaged if they got in the water. This one's a Submariner, right? Like I want to see if it can still hold up. And I don't really know what to expect here. I guess I would expect it to fail this test, probably, because it's just really old and like the gaskets need to be changed and it doesn't take much of a something to make it fail. So we're going to test this at 3 bars, which is kind of the standard test. And the air will get pressurized into the case. And then I put it in water. And then when I release the air pressure from this chamber, any air that's pressurized in the case is going to try to come out. And that'll be in the form of bubbles. Let's see. Okay. So those bubbles that came out, oh, this is actually really good. So those initial bubbles that come out, those are just in the bezel. But what you're looking for is a stream of bubbles or a consistent source of bubbles coming out. And there isn't one. Wow. The little Submariner that could, huh? This thing's still actually passing on 3 bars. Wow. I wouldn't say I'm shocked, but I'm impressed. That's really cool. Because the truth is, you know, to wear a watch day to day, you don't need it to pass that level. Right? I mean, that level is jump in the pool level, right? Which, by the way, I would not recommend doing with any vintage watch. I don't care if they told you that it passed. Like this one, it just passed that test. There's no way I'm jumping in any pool with this watch on my wrist. I'm just not doing it. It's not worth it. Although I will say that, you know, if you asked me how that would go, I would say it'd probably be fine. But come on, these things are super valuable now. This thing's like double what I paid for it originally. And, let's just say I'm not jumping in the pool with it on my wrist. But the real bar, right, for water resistance on a day-to-day use is that you can like wash your hands, or if it rains a little bit, or if you just get splashed on or something like that, that it's not going to destroy the watch. And that's really the bar. And most vintage watches, if they have any type of gaskets at all, will pass that test. So one of the ways, by the way, that they keep these watches waterproof is this. There's a outer bezel with the numbers on it, but there's an inner bezel that I'm using the special tool to separate from the case. And it actually goes around the outside of the crystal. And the crystal is actually made of acrylic. It is a form of plastic, basically. It's very tough, very impact resistant. It's not the most scratch resistant. They do scratch, but you can buff them out very easily. But it means that it's a little bit pliable, right? Think of a sapphire crystal, which is like a super hardened type of glass, let's say. That would shatter, right? Very, very hard, but whoa, that's pretty dirty, actually. Yowza. Oh, now I'm really glad I'm getting in here and cleaning this thing. I didn't know that was so dirty under there. But as you can see, that outer ring goes around that crystal, and then it gets friction fit on, so it squishes the crystal up against that inner bezel and against the outer bezel. And what that will do is that will create a watertight seal for the front part where the crystal is. You do still have to, of course, worry about the case back being watertight, and then the other place that the water can get in. And by the way, this is the number one operator error, let's say, is the crown. If you loosen your crown and put your watch in the water, the water will go in immediately. And that is a major, major, major problem, especially if it's salt water. But that, again, you have to always make sure that that crown is tightened back down, because I have fixed watches on this channel where people put the watches in water and they had the crown out and they just didn't know. But those are the 3 things that you need to do. You need to be able to keep water from coming in around the crystal, around the case back, which is what we're looking at here. And let's just go ahead and take out the current gasket, which looks totally fine. This probably means that the person who sold me the watch replaced these gaskets, because these are in really, really good shape. They're still pliable. They're not brittle. They're not cracked. And there's the aluminum outer bezel. I was told that one's original to the watch, and I don't have any reason to think otherwise. Okay, now we can put everything into the watch cleaning machine. So with the movement in these baskets, you can submerge them in this liquid. There's actually 3 separate ones, and it will give this watch a good, thorough cleaning. And the idea here is to dissolve any of the built up oil, dirt, debris, anything that could be on the jewels or on the moving parts, and to make sure that this thing looks great. Now, while this watch is cleaning, I did want to mention I have a Patreon for this channel. It's patreon.com/wristwatchrevival. And it's a way that you can support your favorite content creators. Basically, you go to Patreon, you go to my page, you can sign up. You can sign up for any level you want. You can change it anytime. You can quit anytime. You get some cool bonuses for being a patron supporter, but it's totally optional. And I really appreciate everybody who supports me over there. Thank you. Now, one of the other key parts of cleaning a watch is ultrasonic cleaning. Now, you can use this for the movement, but since I have the watch cleaning machine, I don't usually need to. But I do use this for the case and the bracelet and stuff like that. So distilled water goes in, and then the cleaning solution goes in, and there's a whole bunch of those out there. I use one that was recommended from another YouTube channel, watch repair tutorials from Alex over there, and I like the one that he recommended. It's kind of like a industrial, I think it's like a medical device cleaning solution that is meant for ultrasonic cleaners. Whoop, I almost knocked down my camera. And I found it to work just fine for this type of stuff as well. So the ultrasonic cleaner also, maybe you can see a little bit of steam coming off there. It also does heat the solution as well to help clean the parts even more thoroughly. And the beauty of an ultrasonic cleaner, whoops, good catch, ultrasonic cleaner, is that it is non-abrasive. So this is a way to clean into little tiny crevices and cracks that you realistically wouldn't be able to get any type of like tools or cleaner into. And also to do it without removing the patina from the outside of the watch, for example, or changing, the way it looks in that way. And as you can see, here's all the parts laid out. It looks like a lot. It is kind of a lot. This is a fairly simple watch. It's got 3 hands. It has hours, minutes, and seconds. No date, but it is an automatic watch as well, which means it has that mechanism at the back that winds itself as you move your hand through the day. And that, of course, does add a bit of complexity to it as well. Okay, this kind of grimy looking, greasy, oily stuff, this is braking grease. And this is put around the outside of the barrel on an automatic watch, because unlike a manual wind watch, where if you wind it up, it kind of stops at some point, you can't wind it any further. Automatic watches don't know when to stop winding. They just keep going. And so what that means is you need it to kind of have like something to hold it up around the outside. But if it does get overwound, it'll slip a little bit as it goes around the barrel. So that's what this braking grease does. And of course, just a little amount, when it comes to applying these things, it's usually less is more when it comes to oils. And by the way, you can never get away from the supervisor. She has to come up and make sure that I'm doing everything correctly and check on my work at all times. But it looks like, once again, we narrowly passed muster, and we can continue with the restoration. Next up, I'm going to reuse the mainspring. I felt like that mainspring was in really good shape, and I don't know, I kind of want to keep the original mainspring to the watch for now. Probably on the next time I service it, I'll just go ahead and replace the mainspring as well. But it's always a judgment call, and I don't have one on hand, and if the watch I think has good potential and the mainspring looks like it's in good condition, I'll often just reuse it. It also means I get to use my mainspring winders. These are one of the weird tools that you get for watchmaking, but they're really fun to use. I'm not going to lie. Whenever I get to use these, I kind of get excited. This is basically a way to completely wind up the spring into another barrel, which is the one I'm holding in my hand, and then that lets me transfer it back to the mainspring barrel without damaging it. You can see at the very end of the spring, it kind of splits there. That's another way that tension is put on the outside wall of the mainspring barrel, and that's that little flap that I just put in there is the part that's going to be pushing up against that grease that I put on. Can gently remove the handle that I used to wind the mainspring back into place. And then now the mainspring seated safely in the mainspring winder tool here. You can see it, and all I have to do is just simply push it back in. But this is like such the best part. Look at that. See? How cool is that? That's why that's why some of these specialty tools are so fun to use. Now I can put the barrel arbor back into place. This goes into that last little spiral of the mainspring, and actually on the edge of that circular arbor, there's a little tiny hook that'll grab onto the mainspring so that it can be turned. A little bit of oil here where this cap meets up with the arbor as well, just to make sure it can spin freely. And once I secure the cap back on, the barrel will be ready to go. You can use a pair of tweezers to carefully put it back on. I picked up this tool off of eBay. This is a good example of what I was talking about when it's hard to figure out what tools you actually need. This little thing I have that helps put the lid back on, A, it's completely unnecessary. It makes the job easier, but you don't need it. And B, there's this version that I got off of eBay for like, I don't know, $10 or something. And then there's like the $47 Swiss one that's more or less the same thing, right? And this is not the type of thing that you need to spend the extra money on, but you wouldn't know that until you actually got this one and used it. And I have a little graveyard of, it's in a shoebox, of tools that I've picked myself that I've tried that didn't, work out, that weren't good enough to my standards. And again, that was, part of what I was thinking with the toolkits and all that. It's like, well, I don't want to make everybody else have to go through this process that I did and, waste their time and money on some tools that aren't good enough. Okay, now we can put the train of wheels in. As you can see, each of them has pivots on the top and the bottom that are held in place by a synthetic ruby jewel. And each of them has to be lined up, which makes this part a little bit tricky. You do it for a long time and you start to kind of learn some of the little tricks, and you can feel out when things are going correctly and not. But this is one of the harder parts of putting a watch back together, especially to learn, because you have to be really careful. Those pivots on the top, that's like the little axle part, they're very thin. And if you're not careful and they're not lined up right and you go to screw down one of the bridges, you can break them. That happens all the time if you're, not careful. But like I said, I've been doing this for a while, and so it's a little more of a routine kind of thing for me, I think, at this point. And so what you want to do is you want to put the bridge into place, and then once you feel comfortable that, the wheels are in, you keep a stick or something to stabilize it, and then you can screw it down into place. Now, this is the tricky one, right? Because if you look, there's 4 holes there, right? There's 3 jeweled and then 1 brass in the middle, and they all have to line up at the same time. So what you want to do is just take your time. You can manipulate the wheels. That's what you want to see right there, though. When you move it, the whole thing moves at once in like a smooth motion. That's what you want. And then you take the plastic stick and you make sure to keep it held down. That way, when you screw down the other screws, the pivots stay in the holes and everything's good to go. Yeah, just another check. You always want to kind of be double checking as you go along to make sure that everything seems like it's working the way that you want to. And then you can go to the next step after that. I like to use a little bit of medium viscosity oil between where the barrel arbor and the barrel bridge meet, just so that is a good smooth operation. And if there's a little extra oil, just use some Rodico to clean it up. And again, always double checking, letting that oil kind of seep around. And we can continue with the rebuild here with the click. This is the click and the click spring. It's a ratcheting system that lets the watch wind one direction, which is, where you're actually winding the watch up, and not go slipping back the other direction. This is important for manual wind or automatic movements. They both need to have this type of system where you can turn something. It's usually the crown, though, on an automatic works, it's the winding rotor and or the crown. It depends on how the automatic is set up. But you need that. That allows you to store the power and to slowly release it over time, which is, that might sound simplistic, but the funny part is that's literally all the watch is designed to do, is to store up the power from the mainspring and then release that power in very specific intervals. That's what a wristwatch actually does. It is about how the power is let out of the mainspring. It's not like, I think in our electronic world, we think about like, okay, here's the battery that powers it, and then it lets the other thing do something, right? This would be like charging up a battery and then tracking very, very, very carefully how long it takes and how the battery loses its power. That's what we're really doing here. It's not the same relationship that I think we're used to with electronics, which is kind of funny. Okay, so now I can put the ratchet wheel on and I can actually give the watch a little bit of a wind to make sure that it's all... That's weird. It looks like it's like not smoothly... What is going on here? That should be very smooth when I do that. Huh. It seems like something might be screwed up with the escape wheel there. So I'm just really quickly going to take off the train wheel bridge to give it an inspection because it wasn't sitting quite right. Let's take a look. Oh no. Oh, no. I didn't really do this after all that talk, did I? Oh my, I totally did. Oh, this is embarrassing. So it looks like, yep, I broke the top pivot off of my own watch's escape wheel. All right. Well, the good news is these are obtainable still. They're not cheap, but they are attainable. So I am going to spend $150 on this, and let's try again. It's funny, after talking about how not easy, but how friendly these are to work on, and about being extra careful, I wasn't. And that escape wheel at some point there must have gotten a little bit out of the pivot, and then when I screwed down the bridge, it broke that pivot. It was exactly what I described about what not to do, and I did it. All right. Well, at least it was on my watch and not on somebody else's, I suppose. I mean, the truth is, of course, these things are going to happen occasionally. None of us are perfect, even, if you're really good at something. Again, this is my hobby, so, I hold myself to as high of a standard as I can, but mistakes will be made, let's just say. But as you can see, thoroughly double checking every single time as I go to screw this in. As long as the train is freely spinning, I'm okay to screw down this bridge and hopefully not break apart. So please just do it right. Okay, there we go. That's much, much better. Now I can go back to put the ratchet wheel on again. God, that is too funny. Oh, I'm going to fix my own watch and then I break it. At any rate, we can continue with the reassembly here, right back to where we were before. There's, of course, a number of different ways that you can approach this hobby as well. I would say my approach is mostly practical, meaning that, I try to make judgment calls based on a number of factors: the watch itself, what it's going to be used for, its value, the risk associated with working on certain parts, doing certain things. This is the type of watch, I wear this watch all the time, right? Like this is one of my go-to, like I said, if you watch the videos and you look, you'll see that I wear this watch a lot. So, for me, I'm willing to, do whatever needs to be done to make sure that this thing's going to be running very strongly for a long time. But I've also worked on, pocket watches for people that weren't going to be worn. right? Nobody's like carrying around a pocket watch anymore, or if very few people do. It's more about remembering a relative or having a cool little piece of history. And for like those pieces, you know, I'm a little bit less strict with myself about the performance of it, let's say. And I'm also a little bit more conservative about the types of different things that I'll do to the watch, especially around the hairspring, especially around, you know, with some of them with parts that are almost impossible to replace, that type of thing. So everybody has to kind of meet it where you meet it. And certainly when I first started doing the hobby, I mean, I was much more loose with myself about it. I was like, yeah, you know, if something goes wrong, like this is the part where you're learning. At the point I'm at now, where I've been doing this for a few years and my comfort level's a lot higher with it, I'm much harder on myself. You know, you know, I want these things to perform very well and I want to do a really, really good job on it. And I mean, I'll be honest with you too, the fact that you're here with me watching also motivates me, you know, because the truth is every mistake I make, I put in these videos and everybody gets to see them, you know, so I would like to limit them on that level as well. This is, by the way, the bottom side of the barrel, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the top, where I'm going to use an oiler with a little bit of medium viscosity oil just to get a little bit of oil between the bridge and the top of that barrel there. Now we can take the winding crown, the crown and the stem here, and I'm going to use a little bit of blue grease. This is a specialized synthetic grease. In fact, actually all of the oils that I use now are all synthetic oils. None of them are based on organic. There are some that are still sold that are like that, and they're very high quality as well. But I think these ones are even better. You know, the level of quality of these lubricants is a big part of why watches used to need to be serviced much more often than they do now. You can really start to push the service intervals out a fair bit by using high quality oils. That's an intermediate wheel that goes in between. Basically, you know, when you look at a watch like this, you would probably like conceptually break down the watch into this one, probably into 4 major areas. There's the motion works, which is the kind of middle part there with those big gears. Those are what control the hands. And then there's the keyless works, and that's the part that controls the winding and setting of the watch. And then, of course, you know, there's the main mechanics of the watch itself on the other side, the watchmaker side, that has, you know, the train of wheels, the barrel, that kind of stuff. And then I think for a watch like this, since it's a separate module and everything, you would also talk about the automatic work. So the part of the watch that's responsible for winding it. The interesting part about most watches, or uninteresting thing about most watches that have an automatic works as well, is that they're usually optional. And what I mean by that is, like in this watch's case, I could just not put that on. It would greatly reduce the functionality of the watch as it was intended, because it wouldn't wind itself anymore and you'd have to wind it up every single day. But it would work. But it's not really how this watch was designed to be operated. So of course it's always better to rebuild it fully. But I always just find it interesting that some of the things in a watch are very much integral to the watch design and functionality, and some of it are like a module that you can kind of add on. If you've ever seen a chronograph, I mentioned them before, that's the watches that have a full-on like stopwatch built in. It's a lot of complication. I've done a few videos on them on the channel here as well if you want to see that. But there are a number of them that whole chronograph part, the whole stopwatchy part, that's also a module that's just added to the top. And some of them have integrated functionality with that as well. It just depends on the brand and the design and the price and all that kind of stuff. Okay, a little bit more blue grease here as we finish up with the keyless works. This grease is very good for high friction applications, meaning when it's going to be metal on metal and held under some type of tension, this type of grease is the stuff that does very, very well with that. But again, if you don't want extra grease flying around in the movement, so, you know, a little bit of Rodico, that kind of silly putty style stuff to help clean up, it does a good job. And then a quick test just to make sure that it's working properly. Makes it look just right. One thing that I still need to clean here is the pallet fork. I didn't put that into the watch cleaning machine. There's like a little bit of risk doing it because of how those jewels are held into the pallet fork. And so I just do it manually instead. That solution I put the pallet fork in is called One Dip. It's a solvent. So it kind of dissolves any debris or dried on oil that might still be on there. Okay. Now I can put the pallet fork bridge as well as the screw into place. And I do need to make sure that this pallet fork is aligned properly. And one of the ways you can do that is by putting a little bit of a wind in the watch and then very, very, very gently touching the side of the pallet fork. And what you want to see is it kind of drag itself over under its own power. That lets you know that it's properly situated. Okay, we can put the balance back on now and see if we've got a running watch. And then assuming that it does run, let's not assume. Let's see what it does. I did have to replace a part here. Might need a little bit more wind in the watch before it'll really pick up. No, yeah. Okay, it seems to be going. All right, so we've got a running watch again. Assumption warranted. And, of course, that means that we'll need to lubricate the watch. And that's a really important part of the process. It's also, it's easy. It's interesting. It's not that hard to do well enough that you're not making a huge mistake. The big mistake would be to over oil these by dumping a whole bunch in there with your oiler and thinking, well, the more the merrier. I really want this to be, this watch to be super, super run well. So more oil, right? And the answer is no. That's actually the mistake that you can make is by putting too much oil on. You pretty quickly can get to the range where you're making maybe we'd call it optimal versus suboptimal choices, but not disasters. But it is very hard to be really, really good at it, right? Like where you just get the exact right amount in the exact right place every time. That is hard. I'm still, I still feel very much that I'm practicing in that realm. But again, that's kind of what I like about hobbies like this is that with some diligence and a little bit of training and a little bit of, reading or watching, you can figure out, to get yourself into that realm where you're not making a total mess of it. But it's going to take a really long time to get really good at it. And those to me are the best type of endeavors, the ones that you can get your head around, but take a long time to be really good at. Take a look at this cap jewel. Do you see the dried on oil? That's what I'm talking about. Do you see it there? That little circle in the middle, that jewel should be completely flat and clean with no debris. You shouldn't be able to see anything there. So I'm going to use the pegwood to kind of manually clean it off and then give it another rinse in the One Dip. And let's take a look at it now. See, that's much better, right? No more dried on oil. And that will increase the functionality of the watch and also let the new oil drop sit where it's supposed to. And unfortunately, that is not where it's supposed to. So do you remember when I said that the bigger mistake is to use too much oil? That was too much oil. And it also, I'd like it to be a little more centered. So I'm going to just put it back in the One Dip. It'll dissolve and then we'll try it again. And once again, I'm not happy with that. That was a better size, but it was not in the right place. So let's again start over and try it again. This is just that practiced element that I was talking about. There we go. That's much, much better. So a nicely centered drop. And then I can put the bottom half of the shock setting in place. And as you can see, now the drop of oil is suspended right above that hole in the middle. And that's where the pivot's going to go. And there it is right there. And now I can put the shock setting back into place, knowing that this watch will have just the right amount of oil suspended above it to let it run very well for a very long time. And, there's no shame in having to go back and try it again. It happens all the time. Okay, let's see how it does on the time grapher after servicing. Ooh, look at this. 0 seconds a day, 230 degrees of amplitude, and no beat error. Rolex, baby. This watch was made in 1967, and it was just serviced by me, and it's running perfect. And that's what I love about these things. This is the automatic works, by the way. This is the part that winds up the watch when you wear it and move your hand and wrist and arm around throughout the course of the day. Rolex uses these reversing wheels, they're called, and the outer portion there is that kind of purplish, pinkish color. I love that color. What I've read online, so take it with a grain of salt, because you can read anything you want online, but is that these are coated in some type of Teflon coating or some type of anti-friction coating, and that's what that color comes from. My thought is like it kind of became a signature color for Rolex to do those. I don't know. Maybe it's a combination of both, but they look really cool either way. And this is nice. So as I mentioned, the automatic winding works is like a module, right? It's a technically optional module. And so what that means is that it's a completely separate little rebuild that then interfaces with the movement, but it's not built into it itself. So I can just rebuild this on its own separately of it. Now it does still need proper lubricant, of course, just like the rest of the watch. It gets to the same standards there. Okay, I can set that aside. Oh no. Oops. Right. Okay, so I forgot something. Wow, this is just going swimmingly. So this is the rotor. This is the part that actually spins around, the weighted rotor. But I neglected to put it on first. On many of these watches, you can actually put it on after you build these parts, but not on this one. And I just forgot. So I have to actually just take apart the automatic works that I just put back together, use this little C-clip here to hold the rotor and the main plate for the automatic works together, and then rebuild it again. Is it a big deal? No, not really. It's just one of those little setbacks that you go, right. I probably should have remembered that. This is a little gear that interfaces, by the way, with the rotor, and now I can just quickly put everything back together in the exact same way that I just had it. That happens sometimes. Again, I think people get discouraged with things like that, and it kind of, they overreact to that type of thing where, I screwed up or I had to go back and do it again. And it's like, it actually doesn't take that long, and it's pretty normal to, make a mistake and get a little ahead of yourself. And you just go, okay, I'm just going to undo this and do this again. Cause that's actually my number one advice to people when they ask me if they're having a hard time or if they're just like, I'm scared. There's no time limit, right? Like even for me, I guess I'm making a video out of this, so there's some type of something, but whatever, this is my hobby. Like if I get frustrated or if I decide that this thing is just not working for me tonight and I can't get it right, I can just set it aside and do something else and come back to it when I feel like it. There's no rush. I'm not, this is my watch, right? Like I can take my time, and if I decided, what tonight I'm going to put back together this automatic bridge, and that's it. That's going to be my hobby time. I'll throw a podcast on, and I'm going to get this automatic bridge put back together, and then I'll set it aside and come back again. And you can just kind of have a project that's in a varying states. And I find that to be very compelling, because I believe that most people can do this hobby, and that it's very rewarding if you're into this type of stuff. Like if this is resonating with you, right? If you're going like, I like mechanical stuff, or I like figuring stuff out, or I was the kid who took stuff apart to see how it worked. Like, does that ring a bell? Because I was that person too. I think that this is type of hobby that's really great, mainly because it scratches the itch of much more expensive, bigger hobbies like working on cars or rebuilding vehicles of various sorts or that type of stuff, where this one can fit in a shoebox that goes on a shelf, and you can take it out and work on it when you want, but you still get to restore something mechanical. And at the end of it, you still get something that you get to wear. And that is very, very rewarding. Let's move on to reassembling the case now. We can just simply press the crystal into place, but this inner bezel, it needs to be pressed into, like not with my hands into place, because it needs to completely seal around the bottom. So I'm going to use this is actually a crystal press, but it's called a Rober press. It's made in France, but I've got a couple of dies, that's the top part there, that are more recessed so that they'll actually reach around the edges so that they can push things like this down. You can also use one, so this one kind of screws down from the top, but you can use one where it's more like a lever that you pull down. Different people like different ones. I like this type of press because I feel that you can be more linear with it. Like you can like give it a little bit more, where when you're kind of cranking down on it with your hand on like a lever, it can be a little bit tricky to do, like say just a little bit of force, right? And you can easily overdo it. Okay, new gasket goes in here on the where the crown's going to meet up with the case, and just make sure that it's seated properly so I can again wear this watch every day without having to worry about it. That's really the goal. I mean, again, I consider myself like a practical watchmaker or watch repairer, and I'm not going to tell you, oh well, you can take this down to, well, in this case 200 meters or whatever. No, that's not really what this is about, right? This is about like, can I wear this thing, and if I do I have to worry about it? And, given how it's done so far, the answer is you can definitely wear it and you definitely don't have to worry about it. And that's where I want to be for a watch like this. We can put the hands back on. I want to be very careful with this. This dial, again, is, there's a lot of emphasis on the dial on a vintage watch. At the end of the day, how about this as an example? If I broke a part in the movement, just theoretically, I could replace it. And it will not change my view of the watch in any way, right? But if I put a big fat scratch on that dial, yes, I could spend a significant amount of money to go find another dial for this model of watch, but it's not going to look like this one. Look at that thing. I mean, is that not the most gorgeous vintage dial you've seen? Like, it's just perfect. And that's very difficult to get. And that's the part that isn't really replaceable when it comes to this stuff. So always have to be very careful. One other thing I wanted to mention about putting on the hands is that, what you're looking for when you put the hands on is that they're parallel with each other and with the dial, and that there's sufficient distance between them so that they don't ever touch. If they touch each other, the watch will stop. So take a quick look, and you see at the bottom is the hour hand, middle is minute, and then that second hand at the top. And that's what you want to see, where they're flat and parallel and that there's proper distance between them. And these are just some of the things that you check, as you go through, a watch restoration like this. Now we can recase the movement. You notice that I haven't put on the automatic winding works yet. That's okay. In this case, you can do that after. And it makes it a little bit easier to handle because the weighted rotor kind of wants to flip around. That's literally what it was designed to do. Like it's meant to be flip, flip, flop, flop all over the place. And but that can make casing the watch a little tricky, and you have to work around the rotor. So many watchmakers, I would say most, will wait to put the automatic winding module here, which is what this is, after the watch is already secured into the case, or the movement is secured in the case, excuse me. Good news for us though, it is. And that means that we can put on the automatic winding works. You just want to give it a quick turn, both with the rotor and then also with the crown. That will make sure that the gears are meshed together, and then a quick check of just manually moving it around in both directions, by the way, to make sure that it's actually winding up the watch as it should. One interesting little note here is you'll notice that these screws here are blued. You can see that deep blue tone. None of the other ones are. Why is that? Well, interestingly, that's to differentiate them from the screws on the movement versus the screws on the automatic winding works. So they've essentially color-coded those screws to remind you that these ones go for the automatic works, not for the regular part of the watch, which I always thought was an elegant way to do that. Okay, we can put the case back on now, and we're getting really close to having mostly successfully serviced my own watch here. When it comes to putting on this outer bezel, there's this silicone grease here, which acts to let it be a little bit smoother and also potentially watertight. I'm putting that on just a little tiny bit on this inner bezel that sits in there. But what sits on top of this is actually a thin metal spring. And that's designed to keep a little bit of tension between the watch case and the outer bezel. So this is that thin spring right here. And as you can see, it's not perfectly flat, and that's how it's a spring. Basically, it looks like a wave if you go along from the side, and that'll keep just a tiny bit of tension up on that upper bezel. Now, this old model has a smooth rotating bezel. You know, the newer ones will click when you turn them over, but these old ones don't have that. The other ones are also usually what we call unidirectional, like you can only turn them in one direction, but this one isn't. And I assume that's just because it's, you know, on the older side. So just to make sure though that it fits well, that it's attached properly, and that it sounds right. And then you can secure the bezel that way. And again, always make sure that the crown is seated fully before you go off on your next adventure. Now, one thing that did happen here is I mentioned that these acrylic crystals, which I love, by the way, they can get scratched up fairly easily. And I haven't really cleaned up this particular one in a while. So I'm just going to use a product that I really like called Polywatch to clean it up. It just takes a couple of minutes, and look at the luster that it puts back on it. It really takes out the scratches, but it's non-abrasive. So it does it kind of chemically or whatever, and it works really, really well. Now I can just put the strap back on. I've gone through a bunch of different straps on this particular watch. I have the original metal bracelet. Well, it's probably not original actually, but I have the metal bracelet that came with it when I bought it. But I also am partial to these NATO straps. These are the kind of nylon military style straps. They're very comfortable. This one's actually a really cool one. It's called a Zero Pass strap that I really like. I bought this one from The Anachronist, who's actually like a fellow YouTuber here. This isn't an ad or anything like that, but I just really like these straps. And I just think that the vibe fits the watch. And speaking of vibes, check that thing out. Oh my God, this is like, I know, like if you're not super into watches, this might be like, what? It's just a watch. It has hand to somebody who's deep into it like I am. This is like one of the most beautiful things you could see. I absolutely love this watch, and I'm super happy that you were able to come along with me to restore it. Thank you so much for doing so. And here it is in its natural habitat as well. Although you'll notice it's not underwater. That's going to do it for this one. If you want to find me on Instagram, I am wristwatch_revival over there. I'd love for you to stop over and say hi. And with that, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.